Just beyond the Golden Spike Monument, which commemorates the meeting of the rails of the first transcontinental railroad, we went down a dirt road in a wide valley. As we traveled, the valley spread into an uncanny immensity, unlike the other landscapes we had seen. The roads on the map became a net of dashes, while in the far distance, the Salt Lake existed as an interrupted silver band. Hills took on the appearance of melting solids and glowed under amber light. We followed roads that glided away into dead ends. Sandy slopes turned into viscous masses of perception. Slowly, we drew near to the lake, which resembled an impassive faint violet sheet held captive in a stony matrix upon which the sun poured down its crushing light.
My name is Jaimi Butler. I work at Westminster College's Great Salt Lake Institute. I've been studying Great Salt Lake and have been privileged to be part of this awesome place behind me that is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. The jetty is super cool because it's this place that you come and it's different at all times of the year. The water levels might be different. There might be different salts that have precipitated out onto the lake bed. It gives me this perspective on what the biology in the lake is doing and what people are doing too, which profoundly affects our lake. So right behind me is Gunnison Island, this little sliver of land that looks very tiny and inconspicuous. That is one of the world's largest breeding grounds for American white pelicans. They trade food and fresh water for a safe place to raise their young. So fish don't live in Great Salt Lake, and they have to fly over 30 miles each way every day to catch food for their young and for themselves. I think a really interesting thing about Spiral Jetty, Mars is probably a lot like this. There are these places that have water and ice and all of the salts and minerals that go along with that. And these salt deposits, they actually capture life. So when the salt crystals form, they have these little fluid inclusions that capture these microbes. And the cool thing is they have a lot of pigment in them. And so you'll see kind of orangish or reddish spots in the salt pan. These are the microbes. We do work with NASA, and so if we're going to find life on Mars, which is the kind of directive for this mission, we might find them kind of captured in salt.
An expanse of salt flats bordered the lake, and caught in its sediments were countless bits of wreckage. Old piers were left high and dry, the mere sight of the trapped fragments of junk and waste transported one into a world of modern prehistory, the products of a Devonian industry, the remains of a Silurian technology, and all the machines of the Upper Carboniferous period were lost in those expansive deposits of sand and mud. Two dilapidated shacks looked over a tired group of oil rigs. A series of seeps of heavy black oil, more like asphalt, occurred just south of Roselle Point. For 40 or more years, people have tried to get oil out of this natural tar pool. Pumps coated with black stickiness rusted in the corrosive salt air. A hut mounted on pilings could have been the habitation of, quote, the missing link, unquote. A great pleasure arose from seeing all of those incoherent structures. This site gave evidence of a succession of man-made systems mired in abandoned hopes.
Right now we're at the Roselle tar beds or tar seeps. This is where tar that's been formed underneath Great Salt Lake is seeping out of the bed through these little fissures, and it entraps animals. So if you come out here, I highly encourage you to leave your dogs at home and to wear shoes that are okay to get tar on them and to get ruined. You will see behind me there are some carcasses choruses of young pelicans. There's also a coyote that was scavenging on these pelicans, and they've ended up entrapped in these tar seeps. Right here, I think we're really seeing the effects of low water levels. Probably it has to do with the habitat for the freshwater fish that they eat being decreased. This is about the halfway point to their freshwater feeding grounds. And so these babies probably get tired on their first flight into the wetlands. It's 30 miles away, and they just can't take off again if they don't have enough energy. So the effects of low water is being seen on the ground. 22,000 square miles of watershed of land is scoured by water and wind, and eventually ends in Great Salt Lake because there's no place for any of this to go. I feel like it's kind of Great Salt Lake's memory. This lake has memory of everything that's happened or not happened in this 22,000 square miles that extends over state boundaries, doesn't care about political will or money people are making. And you see that in the salts. You see it in toxins that might enter into Great Salt Lake. And if we let this lake dry up, we're going to have a huge environmental catastrophe on our hands that will impact both our economy and our health and, our quality of life. I hope that that doesn't happen.
It is now my pleasure to introduce our two amazing scholars for this evening. One second. So first we have Hikmet Sidney Loe, who is an educator, writer, and curator, whose work examines the changeable nature of the earth and addresses our perceptual and cultural constructs of the land. Her first book, The Spiral Jetty Encyclo, exploring Robert Smithson's Earthwork through time and place, delves into Robert Smithson's regional concerns in creating his Earthwork. It won the 15 Bytes Book Awards for Art Book in 2018 and was a finalist for the Utah State Historical Society Best Book Award. And then second, we have Jaimi Butler, who is the coordinator of the Great Salt Lake Institute, housed at Westminster College. Despite the Great Salt Lake's reputation for being inhospitable, Jaimi fell in love with the lake and made it her place. Over the past 20 years, Jaimi has helped increase knowledge and shape perceptions of the lake through work in the private sector, government, and academia. Jaimi can barely remember a time when she was not using airplanes, boats, four-wheelers, airboats, and stand-up paddleboards to get around one of Utah's most amazing ecosystems. She is the co-author of the children's book about the lake and co-edited the first book devoted entirely to the biology of Great Salt Lake with Dr. Bonnie Baxter. Welcome both Hikmet Loe and Jaimi Butler. It's a pleasure to have you both here with us today, and take it away.
Hi, thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Willie. That was awesome. And I'm just going to go ahead and start and thank, along with Willie, Utah Humanities for this evening and making this program possible with the other partners. And there were so many sponsors that I didn't know about. So to all the sponsors and everybody, that was great. And a real shout out to Katie. I know that we're going to, Jaimi, talk about the video, but I think that what she did, and I was, some people know, unfortunately not able to be with you. I had to be in quarantine before I left Utah to come to New Mexico. And so it was Jaimi's brilliant idea that I do a reading from Robert Smithson's essay, Spiral Jetty, to sort of overlay and have that conversation. So a shout out for Katie. And Jaimi, tell us about you. I'm so looking forward to tonight.
Well, you know what? I was just thinking how lucky I am. Hikmet and I met probably in 2008, I think, at Spiral Jetty. Do you think it was 2008?
Oh no,
really?
I think it was earlier than that. It was before you had your job at Westminster.
Yeah, so we've known each other for a long time, and I always put a lot of stock in people that I meet at Spiral Jetty because I mean, it's an adventure, right? Like you take this journey and you're with these people and you never know what you're going to find when you go out to Spiral Jetty.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, the passage that you read for this program, I think is so beautiful that Robert Smithson could write something in 3 or 4 paragraphs and so accurately describe the environment and kind of the feeling that goes along to that. So maybe you can talk about that. I mean, you've studied Robert Smithson. Like, tell me about him as a writer and as an artist.
Sure. I brought some props. So what I want to do in considering Robert Smithson as an artist and a writer is that he considered himself to be both. He considered himself to be a visual artist, but he was also a writer, and started writing early, was writing in art magazines, and then was writing articles that ended up in art magazines that he considered to be works of art. And so he was continually breaking these artistic boundaries by doing that. Some folks may know that Robert Smithson died accidentally and very unfortunately in a small plane crash in 1973. His wife, the artist Nancy Holt, then, because she had been with him for 10 years, I hope there isn't much glare on this as I'm putting up the prop. This is the first book that is the writings of Robert Smithson. And so Nancy Holt worked with Philip Leiter, who was with Art Forum. Saul LeWitt, the artist, did, you know, sort of the design along with her. And for the very first time, there's this orientation to having a lot of Robert Smithson's writings in one place. And what I wanted to do, you know, me the academic, I have all sorts of things to read and talk to you about, is one of the very first reviews of this book, because the reviewer talks about Spiral Jetty, and I think this is a really nice sort of entree about what we're talking about tonight. And so the reviewer says about this book, it's more than simply a tribute to Smithson. It's also analogous to the retrospective exhibition. One can follow his development from the initial rejection of current practices, which is, we know that about Robert Smithson, to a tentative search for connecting ideas, to a documentation of his deep personal excitement with completed projects of his own. His account of Spiral Jetty is totally involving and exhilarating because there's a positive affirmation of experience and ideas coming together. Through the vivid description, the experience of the artist is communicated completely. The negation of the art world is replaced by that affirmative, which for Smithson was a moral as well as an aesthetic choice. And I think that the more we learn then about Robert Smithson, he was very outspoken, he was very erudite, very intelligent, and went through a process of continually placing himself in the art world and then continually replacing art within the art world, and then we land at Spiral Jetty. And so the first time we have the publication of this essay that he did, The Spiral Jetty, was in 1972 for a book that MIT put together, and then Nancy published it there. It's been republished in several places, and the couple paragraphs that I read for that video are a couple paragraphs out of a 10-page essay where he's interweaving experience. We went to look for a site. It's very straightforward. We talked to this person, we did that, and then all of a sudden there are viscous masses of perception right in front of us. And then, you know, we get to Spiral Jetty that way.
And how, I mean, that brings up the question is, you know, how did he find this place? Well, it's so strange, and maybe I'm not sure what our level of knowledge about Great Salt Lake is right now, and so I'm going to just go back and kind of like talk about it.
Sure.
Great Salt Lake is a terminal basin. So it means that 22,000 square miles of this watershed drain into Great Salt Lake, and it scours all of those rivers and all of that water, scouring little bits of minerals and anything that they encounter along the way, including the actions that people take on the land. And what happens is that water goes into this basin, and then the water evaporates, but it leaves behind those little bits of salts and minerals and things that are in there. And so we end up with a salt lake, a lake that is about the pink part of Great Salt Lake is about 10 times saltier than the ocean. The green part of Great Salt Lake, it's separated by a railroad causeway that prevents water from flowing in between. And so that green part of the lake is about 5 times saltier than the ocean. So we're talking, you know, this closed or terminal basin where all of this salt is going. And it's very unique because not everything can live in water that's 10 times saltier than the ocean. And the things that can live in there are pink. They color that water, or that water and the salts around Spiral Jetty a pink color. And so I know Robert Smithson had a very specific set of attributes that he was looking for. So maybe you can talk about that.
Absolutely. And you know, because you have been to Mono Lake in California, where I have not been yet. It's on my bucket list once traveling happens all the time again. Excuse me, he had actually been to Mono Lake in 1968. He was there again with his wife, the artist Nancy Holt, and their friend, the artist Michael Heiser. And they do performative action out there. They're filming each other, they're photographing each other. They're reading bits of dialogue that's related to that site. So this is 1968, and that is that beginning of his interest in these bodies of water, because Mono Lake is so similar to Great Salt Lake. It's an inland body of water that only is leaving through evaporation. And so the masses that are there, the brine shrimp, the flies, all of the things. And I think I have a picture in my book. Yes, I'm going to do that right now. There's the book. And Jaimi contributed really amazing photographs to the book. And I think one of your photographs in the book are the brine flies at Mono Lake. And so Smithson is interested in, through that project that only comes to light to the public in 2004. This is 1968, they're all on this trip. Things fall apart in their friendship, 1970 with Spiral Jetty. That's a story for another time. And that project sits on the shelf until 2004, when the first national retrospective of Robert Smithson's work is going to be shown. It's at Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, and then travels, goes to Texas, goes to New York. And Nancy Holt, what she does is she works on that project from 1968 and turns it into the film Mono Lake. And the first time I saw that, it was one of those head-blown experiences, because there was the template. There was everything that he had done and thought about related to inland bodies of water. And so I thought that important enough. I received permission to transcribe that film, and that transcription is in my book, because I make a lot of correlations. You know, I think that it's sort of this preamble to Spiral Jetty. Well, you know, again, he is writing lots of different things. And when he writes the essay, The Spiral Jetty, the very first thing he says after a quote about the color red is, "My concern with Salt Lakes began with my work in 1968 on the Mono Lake non-site in California. Later, I read a book called Vanishing Trails of Atacama by William Rudolph, which described salt lakes, salares in Bolivia, in all stages of desiccation and filled with microbacteria that give the water surface a red color. Pink flamingos, he talks about that. Beaches gray because of the remoteness of Bolivia, and because Mono Lake lacked the reddish color I decided to investigate the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And that's how he comes to that. He's already got that groundwork set up. He's already working on his site, non-site sculptures, and he takes all of those ideas and in 1970 expands everything out at Great Salt Lake.
I want to share my screen with you for a minute. I want to show any folks that haven't seen like how like wonderfully, beautifully red and pink. I actually have always described it as pink lemonade. And so this is on a plane flight, and you can see just how pink this water is around Spiral Jetty. That's, you know, it extends 1,000 feet into Great Salt Lake, and it's 1,500 feet long. Mm-hmm. And we study these. I want to bring up this like interesting connection because at Great Salt Lake Institute, we study these microorganisms as a connection to Mars. And so this is what they look like in a Petri dish if you culture them. And actually, we've done a lot of work. This is an image from NASA, actually, that they've been working on these terraces and these microorganisms that are colored pink. You can see the jetty. You can see these. I'll show you some. I have some gypsum crystals. And right. And so this is very science heavy. And when I got this paper and I noticed that I was one of the authors on the paper, I was like, I don't really know what the title of this means. It's a little bit sciencey. I feel like I'm a little bit out of my element. And so it turns out that the Mars rover, and there's going to be a Mars rover that's landing on February 18th, just in less than a month, in a couple weeks, that we're actually going to be there. NASA's going to be collecting samples from Mars because the environment of Great Salt Lake is very similar to the Jezero crater where the rover is landing, and they're going to be taking samples. And when those samples come back to Earth, we're going to be using technology that was, we're going to be using lessons learned at Great Salt Lake to analyze those samples. And I think this is like this really like cool connection to Mars and right. What's going on, and that those pink halophiles that can live in 30% salt water.
How's that for some pink that goes into sort of like this amazing vivid? Because you know, as you mentioned in the video, and it's literally a sentence that Robert Smithson says in his essay, that every time you're at the Spiral Jetty, it's different. And mm-hmm. So that pink is amazing, but sometimes it's a little orange, or sometimes the water feels flat and gray. I mean, it's this sort of amazing environment to be able to have those perceptual aha moments with it.
And it's so fun because as a scientist, I look at that stuff. I mean, sometimes the water looks orange, and that means there's different microorganisms that are living in there, and probably I love the name of them. They're called Dunaliella salina. I love Latin names. And then other times you'll go to the jetty and you'll see the lake that's, you know, the water level or the shoreline is rimmed with like yellow stuff. It looks, and people always think, oh, there's gunk. That's right. Actually pollen that's blowing into Great Salt Lake, and it's washing up on the shorelines. And then other times the lake is so still that it reflects the sky and it looks blue, or it looks more purple. And I'm maybe taking us off track a little bit, but I use Spiral Jetty as kind of my watermark, because I can see, you know, water levels of Great Salt Lake that differ. You know, sometimes the water will go into all of the spirals, and they'll kind of hug the spirals and the basalt rock. And then other times it's just white. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Sure, absolutely. And that is wonderful. So when Robert Smithson created Spiral Jetty in 1970, and this was sort of a planning over several months that he did to get to that point, and then he was there for several weeks as he is working on the work, you know, the earthwork itself. What he was really interested in Great Salt Lake is, along with everything we've talked about so far, so much more, because he was interested in the dynamic environment of Great Salt Lake. He was interested in that idea of that it looked different every time you went out there, and that the water levels were different. So Robert Smithson, the historian and the researcher and the scholar, because he was all of those things, amassed a pretty substantive library of materials related to the lake that had to do with biology, geology, deep time, with all of these things, which is how he then is writing an essay that embeds all of those aspects into it. But he knows, because he's done the research, that 1963 had been that low point of the lake. Mm-hmm. And then in 1970, the lake is a little higher. He knows that what's going to happen is that the lake is probably going to go up and down. He and Nancy Holt visited the lake several times after 1970. And then, of course, those visits ended because of that plane accident that I had mentioned. It didn't dawn on me. I was trying to remember the year. I think it was it 2004 where it rained a lot and it was really wet and it was really rainy? There was a year in there where I was going to be taking a group of people to Spiral Jetty, and it was a large group of people, and then it started, and we were working for a couple months to make sure that there was a lovely trip. Then it started raining, and then it didn't stop. And then I had to call my contact to say, did you actually want to walk on the Spiral Jetty? Because that's not a thing anymore. And the entire trip got canceled. That's when I started putting on my website photographs of what the Spiral Jetty looks like, with the correlated to the lake levels. And so that is that information. And then I went through, I've got all of these sort of, again, based on Robert Smithson's interest in lake levels, right? I've got a graph on where that water goes. And I've got sort of starting from 1970 going on through every year at Spiral Jetty, what is the lake level? And so that's why I then, you know, on my website had just added that other information in, because it's interesting to me, and I certainly appreciate that sometimes people go out there, and it hasn't happened for a while because we've been in a drought for so long, but people will be disappointed if they can't see the jetty. Like, they go there and they want to see the jetty. And so getting that information there. But the dynamic nature of that, and what you had talked about, it's Robert Smithson's interest in observing nature and being really interested in that individual perceptual aspect of being in nature. And for an artist, again, we have to think back to the 1970s. This was newer, and definitely a newer idea.
I'm gonna share my screen again. I want to show people what happens to lake levels at Great Salt Lake. And, you know, this is one of the things that I think a lot of us are very worried about. Mm-hmm. So this is from 1984. This is after Robert Smithson built Spiral Jetty. It was kind of in high water years. Yeah. And you can see how dynamic the lake is. And it's not just the shorelines that are changing. It's also the salinity or the salt content of the water that are changing at the same time. And so it's interesting to me that he was kind of thinking about that and wondering about that.
Absolutely.
And I think,
yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, and it only pops up once in the literature. And again, I'm not home with all my Robert Smithson books behind me, so I don't have access to it here. And it's somewhere in my book. He had said at one point in an interview, if the Spiral Jetty goes underwater, I'll just build the jetty up another 15 feet. Who knows what he actually really meant by that, because the Spiral Jetty wasn't 15 feet tall when he originally built it. It was, you know, like 2 to 3 feet tall. And so adding another 15 feet seems a little monumental. But again, he didn't have that sort of ability. When he passed away in 1973, Spiral Jetty was underwater and continued to remain underwater through the 80s. Anybody in the audience who was in Utah in the 80s and remembers the sandbagging of State Street and how Great Salt Lake became huge, and could the planes really land at the airport, and the sandbagging of the railroad that was out there? I mean, Great Salt Lake turned into the very large lake that it was in the 1980s. And then nature changed again, and those lake levels started to come down when in 1993, Spiral Jetty became visible for the first time in 20 years.
Can I go to my science nerdery just for a minute,
Sure,
Hikmet?
of course.
So many people, I'm going to show you a map of Great Salt Lake. This is from a children's book that Dr. Bonnie Baxter and I wrote, but I think it's simple and really fun. And so you can see here in this image, we have Spiral Jetty. And I want to show you this little island that's right here. So this is Gunnison Island, and Gunnison Island is the second largest breeding ground for American white pelicans. And it's just this little destitute kind of island with no trees and hardly even any bushes that pelicans, these ground nesting birds, can lay their eggs and can live. And I mean, who knew that there were pelicans living at Great Salt Lake? And it turns out that pelicans move from Gunnison Island to the freshwater wetlands every day to feed their young. And here's Spiral Jetty. I don't have it marked in this image, but here is Spiral Jetty, and it's essentially halfway in between Gunnison Island and the freshwater wetlands that the parents have to fly every day over 30 miles to get to capture fish for their young and then bring them back to Gunnison Island. Here's some baby pelicans.
They're so cute.
I know, they are so adorable. But the reason that I'm talking about this is thinking about Robert Smithson and his interest in science and description, because one of the things that I've noticed is in his essays, he doesn't talk about seeing the pelicans in April when he was building Spiral Jetty. Have you heard anything about that? Like, tell me more about that.
You know, actually, I haven't. He was there. I mean, he visited, you know, in January, maybe in February. He was there in April, but I don't have there. And I've, for my book, you know, I spent time at the Archives of American Art, going through his files, going through his papers. And so I don't have any recollection right now about that, about the pelicans.
And I guess I should back up a little bit and say, when you're at Spiral Jetty, you can see these pelicans, and they fly, hundreds of them will fly so close to over your head that you can hear their wings whistling. And it's a phenomenon. It's not just like a cool, like seeing a bird thing. And so I was kind of shocked to not hear anything about that from Smithson or Nancy Holt. And and
maybe the days on and off that they were there, they didn't have that experience, and that's too bad. I mean, that sort of sonic, being enveloped in that sonic experience at that site. I mean, the first time I went out to Spiral Jetty and finally actually found it, so I tried, couldn't find it. I mean, I end up at like some military reserve or something somewhere. Anyway, I finally find it in early '96, and there weren't any sounds out there at all. There was nothing. Like, there were no birds. There was just nothing going on.
Yeah.
Do you mind for a second? We have a comment and then 2 questions in the chat. Do you mind if I go to that for a minute?
Oh, go for it. I was actually going to go to Kim. Kim just asked a question about if you could speak to the permanent versus ephemeral qualities of Spiral Jetty.
Yeah.
So assuming that Smithson was aware it would disappear at some point and it would disappear at some point, I'm interested in its place in the land art between Andy Goldsworthy's work and something like Mount Rushmore, and how Smithson thought about the deterioration of Spiral Jetty over time.
Sure. In a word, and hey, Kim, it's nice to see your name again, former student.
Oh.
Yeah. In a word, what we can do is we can reference entropy. Robert Smithson was very much interested in the concept of entropy. This is, to be sciencey, it's the second law of thermodynamics that is established after the Industrial Revolution, where it has to do with steam and force. And Robert Smithson reinterpreted entropy as, and he gives a really brilliant example for this. He has, takes this idea of a sandbox, and entropy is if you have white sand on one side and black sand on the other, and you start to mix them. You have moved forward in time and enacted processes that can never go back to where they were. Entropy is that continual movement of time and that change of environment, of site, of situation that can't be gotten back to again. And so the deterioration of Spiral Jetty has certainly happened. We could call it other things. We could call it settling into the earth. We could call it, right, there are a lot of different factors that go into how Spiral Jetty looks now as opposed to what it had looked like previously. And what is interesting is that then in that process, he wanted it to be entropy, right? He wanted to know that that was always going to happen and take place. He called it the entropic landscape, right? A landscape that was going to show the vestiges of human waste, the, sort of the metals that are there, all of the sort of garbage that used to be out there and that got cleaned up in 2006. And so it's very different, and it's a very different idea than what Andy Goldsworthy has done, as he is working with natural materials that are going to be very temporary. So that sort of temporal aspect of Andy Goldsworthy is on a different time scale than Robert Smithson.
Can I ask you, Hikmet, because
Sure.
I'm not familiar with Andy Goldsworthy. Can you tell me more about his work?
Sure.
And their work.
What I haven't done, his work,
Okay.
what I haven't done yet is pulled up a website, and I certainly could do that, and then I could share my screen, right? So in my classes, I often show the film that was done about him called Rivers and Tides. And it's a really wonderful sort of experience to watch the film, then to see how he works on a very, very ephemeral basis. So if he is gathering leaves together and putting them here, they're going to blow away. These stones are not going to stay. These leaves that are really kind of, and Jaimi, do me a favor, give me a heads up. Does this look okay? Are you seeing the screen?
Yeah, it looks great. Yeah.
Okay. So this is very different. His idea, here's a lovely, again, the leaves that are going to blow away, these rocks that he's formed into a spiral. That idea of time as a medium, time as an artistic medium, is considered very differently by both of these artists. What's interesting, and so y'all go look at Andy Goldsworthy. So
thank you, Hikmet.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now for that. I do want to mention something because Kim does mention Mount Rushmore. Robert Smithson, and I talk to my students about a certain thing that we get to sort of hold in place. We get to consider the past and how people thought about things in the past and study them and look at them. And on the other hand, we get to hold what our current knowledge and understanding is of that same situation. And I'm going to go to Mount Rushmore for that as an example. Robert Smithson revered, I can't ever say his last name, the artist who did Mount Rushmore, because he considered him to be one of the first land artists. And that is something that, as an art historian, I acknowledge, and it is in my book. He also revered Frederick Law Olmsted, who was one of the two men who created Central Park. But, Mount Rushmore, he was part of the Ku Klux Klan, and that's something that we then get to consider today, information that wasn't held in the past, right? Just as with Central Park. I love Central Park. I went there almost every day that I lived in New York City. Displaced a lot of people and turned a lot of people homeless as Central Park was created. And that's a consideration from today that is different than how people, and so it's very interesting being an art historian to have these sort of parallel, because art history is changing so much in our consideration of the past, and our places within that are changing so much too. So yeah. wanted to make sure that that was there.
Well, and Megan asked a question too. Can I answer this question for Megan? She asked, Jamie's visual of the changing water levels is alarming. Can she talk about the real dangers of the diversions existing and planned on the levels of the lake, and the dangers of Great Salt Lake not having its own water right? We have a weird cultural relationship with the lake and need to notice that there is no water in Farmington Bay, and health of this water body is so significant to us. So I showed you, I showed you this time lapse from 1984 to 2016, and you can see these like rapidly changing water levels at Great Salt Lake. And a lot of people tell me, oh, well, if that's always the case, right, they go up and down and they go up and down. Like, what's the danger? The lake changes, it's dynamic. Sure. And my answer to that is, scientists at Utah State, Wayne Wurtzbaugh and company have been doing work on recreating precipitation. And what they've found out is that our precipitation over time has not changed. What has changed is human diversions. And I do think it's really cool the way that how do you look at precipitation 150 years ago if you don't have records? Sure. What they did was they looked at tree rings, and they could tell how much precipitation these trees received in the headwaters. So like at the top of the watershed, they can tell that precipitation hasn't changed over that 150 years. What has changed is water diversions. Yeah. And so right now, Great Salt Lake is 40% smaller than it was. It's dropped by 11 feet, and that's huge. 11 feet doesn't seem that huge until you consider the average depth of Great Salt Lake is between 11 and 13 feet. And so this is super alarming. And this is before climate change. All of this is happening before climate change. And so I just am not going to shut up about this issue of water getting into Great Salt Lake, and a changing environment is going to need changing behaviors of the 2 to 3 million people that are along the Wasatch Front. And not just through, through everybody doing everything, not just through water rights. Megan mentions water rights, and that is a really awesome place to start. But also through changing our behaviors and changing our cultural attitudes of Great Salt Lake, because if we let Great Salt Lake dry up, it doesn't just mean that the birds disappear. It means that dust comes off of Great Salt Lake, and it can coat our snow and make our snow in our ski areas melt quicker. There's going to be human health effects, because salt isn't the only thing that goes into Great Salt Lake. There's toxins, there's other natural things and human things that go into there that we don't want to be breathing in these dust storms that won't just be during inversion season in Utah, that's going to be during the summertime too. And so, and there's also economic issues. The Great Salt Lake is worth $1.3 billion annually. And that was a 2012 study that they came up with that. And so our economy, and like I said in the video, just our quality of life, like we live along the shores of this super incredible place, and although it's stinky and although it's buggy, it really is one of the most birdiest places in the earth, on the face of the planet, and it's in our backyard. And so I think there's some big like cultural shifts and changes that need to happen, which, like, yeah. And you have your book out. What do you want to talk about?
Absolutely. I'm agreeing with you 100%. Absolutely. Because as somebody who also is interested in, is passionate, has some expertise in Great Salt Lake, it is devastating what is going on right now. As I'm bringing this back to Robert Smithson, because with Spiral Jetty, the spokes are huge that go out and then come back in. He does the work in 1970. He does another monumental earthwork in Emmen in the Netherlands the next year in a disused quarry, okay? So he's already done Spiral Jetty. It's near mining and people who are trying to get oil out of the ground. He does the next work in a disused quarry, and then the third earthwork in Texas, where he unfortunately dies, is on private property, but there's industrial aspects of what's going on out there also. When we read, and I'm not going to give this as an assignment, but when we read Spiral Jetty, that 10-page essay, there's a certain level of, I mean, it's brilliant, and he's also showing off his brilliance. Compare that to, and I want you to just kind of like hang in there with me, this essay that he wrote in 1971 that was unpublished, and it's untitled, because it gets back to what you're talking about with Great Salt Lake and what his concern was. He starts shifting his narrative and focus and becomes very adamant. Quote, "Across the country, there are many mining areas, disused quarries, and polluted lakes and rivers. One practical solution for the utilization of such devastated places would be land and water recycling in terms of earth art. Recently, when I was in Holland, I worked in a sand quarry that was slated for redevelopment. The Dutch are especially aware of the physical landscape. A dialectic between land reclamation and mining usage must be established. The artist and the miner must become conscious of themselves as natural agents. In effect, this extends to all kinds of mining and building. When the miner or builder loses sight of what he is doing through the abstractions of technology, he cannot practically cope with necessity. The world needs coal and highways, but we do not need the results of strip mining or highway trusts. Economics, and that's why I was laughing, because I read the word economics when you said economics. Economics, when abstracted from the world, is blind to natural processes. Art can become a resource that mediates between the ecologist and the industrialist. Ecology and industry are not one-way streets. Rather, they should be crossroads. Art can help to provide the needed dialectic between them. A lesson can be learned from the Indian cliff dwellings and earthworks mounds. Here we see nature and necessity in consort. This is the Robert Smithson in 1971. And then in 1973, he has contacted many different mining companies around the country to be that agent, to be working to help out because of his environmental conscious.
I really love Susan's comment. She asked, is Spiral Jetty about us, our environment spiraling out of control?
Oh,
I love that question.
Are you I think you're seeing different questions than I am, which I kind of love. No, really, I'm like, oh, where's that question? I don't know. What do you think? Jaimi, you take this and then I'll chime in.
I think about this a lot because, I mean, at the jetty, you can see like the direct effects of humans on a yearly, even a monthly basis. You can see this. And so I really love that interpretation. Yeah. And go ahead.
No, you finish. Go for it.
Well, Pam asked a question about the cultural shifts that we think need to happen. Like, what are some specifics?
Oh, interesting.
And so, I think, do you go?
Well, no, I think I finally figured out what's going on. You're looking at the Q&A and I'm looking at
I'm looking at the Q&A.
There we go. Right. Then, okay, I'm going to keep the Q&A up there because I want to get back to Susan's comment about that project in the main island. All right, let's backtrack. First things first. Spiral Jetty, what was the question? Is it us or them?
Yeah, is it us? Is it this like narrative on humans spiraling out of control?
Oh, interesting. It was Robert Smithson's answer to the Times. I am not sure that he was thinking about that. One of the main context of my book is that it is based on his essay and then the transcription of his film, Spiral Jetty, which he did, and the transcription of Mono Lake. All of the encyclopedic entries, except for just a couple that have to clarify what's going on in the book, come from Robert Smithson. And during the time that he's doing it, he's talking a lot about, the cultural history of the region. He's certainly talking about the science, he's talking about time, he's talking about geology, he's talking about the process of building Spiral Jetty. There's a lot of information that he puts out there about the work, but there isn't this, there isn't a sort of like, and now I open my arms to everybody to come and see this. He knew that was going to happen, of course, because he made sure that there were pictures of Spiral Jetty on art magazines by that fall. His movie's done, it's at the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, there's an open arm invitation in that sort of way, but there was also a narrative back then that's very different than the one now, that it was remote, you couldn't get to it. It was onerous. Oh my God, you had to get in a car and you had to drive north of Salt Lake City and you would get lost and the road was horrible. And so there are a lot of different like sort of interesting narratives, some true, some not, that have sort of developed out of he builds this where he builds it. So I'm not really sure about his, that sort of open arm aspect. He did it because he could. But he did it because he could, because he got all of the right permits, hired all the right people, did all the right things at that time. So hope that answers that question.
Yes, I think that's awesome. And I have 18 million thoughts.
Right? Yeah, I know.
And it's like,
which is how we were going to play tonight, with our 18 million thoughts. Absolutely.
I want to talk about cultural shifts, because I think that there's this really interesting narrative of Great Salt Lake that I hope that talks like this can kind of help. I'm going to share my screen again. These are TripAdvisor reviews about Great Salt Lake. So a lake of lesser salt, ugh, sticky, smelly, and filled with flies, stinky, don't bother, it's a big disappointment. And so I think one of the major cultural shifts that needs to happen in protecting Great Salt Lake is this narrative. Yeah. And I agree with people, it's stinky.
Sure.
It is so alive.
It's literally called lake stink.
Yeah, it's it's smelly because of all of these microbes that we've talked a little bit about are decomposing critters. There's 10 million birds that come to Great Salt Lake every single year to rest and reproduce, and some of those die, and then the microbes decompose those and kind of make it smelly. And so I agree, it's smelly. I agree, it's buggy. It's one of the buggiest places on the earth. And so I think changing this narrative to just Great Salt Lake is stinky and buggy, it needs to talk about some of the other really important things that are happening at the lake, and that it's on the shores of a major metropolitan area with 10 million birds. I mean, nobody in the world gets to have 10 million birds on their shores, hardly ever. And 3 million of us get to have that. And so I think a narrative is one of those things that really needs to change with Great Salt Lake, recognizing smelly and stinky, but also how birdy it is and how much economy comes from that. And we need to respect the lake enough to conserve water. And we all need to do it. It's not just going to be conserve water and quit flushing our toilets. It's going to be from all areas that we need to start like thinking about Great Salt Lake and bringing that into our narrative and how important it is. So I think, and it's hard to change. We use a lot of water. We use the most water per capita in the entire United States, and we have the lowest water prices in the nation. And so I think, you know, some of those changes are going to be really hard to think about, paying more for water, saving water, and maybe getting rid of our Kentucky bluegrass, and changing some of these water laws that date back to statehood. You know, these water laws were made pre-1900, before any of us understood how important the lake was and how dynamic the lake was, and how we could impact that. And so, Pam, I hope I answered your question a little bit, and maybe Hikmet has some ideas.
No, I would reiterate everything that you said. It's interesting to me that there is sort of so much visceral pushback about Great Salt Lake, right? Like the visceralness of the smell or of the flies, right? The sort of like uncomfortable human experiences that we have. And I feel that those ideas have been around for a long time. And I still encounter people who have those ideas. And I think it's really unfortunate, because it's about that very personal, visceral experience without understanding the broader implications of the environment and how we need to coexist with all of the environments that we have in Utah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One of the things that I learned from you, Jaimi, was about the mercury that was like flying through the air. I mean, I created this visual for myself that's alarming. Mercury flies through the air and comes in, and then rain makes it fall onto the ground, and there isn't water there, or maybe there's water there, but then mercury's in our dust, in our water, and then we're smelling it and it's in our bodies. I think that's alarming. You can also correct what I heard you tell me, if that was accurate or not, because I sort of blew that, you know, big and huge. But thinking about what our environment and how it is that we can look at it and not have, you know, Smithson talks a lot about dialectic, having those two conversations that are held together. There isn't an end to it. There is one side and the other side that are combined to have that conversation. And sometimes we have that dialectic, it's like sort of mind over body. Sometimes we separate out. And I think the cultural shift that has to start taking place is to understand, as people before the Euro-Americans were there, that the land is no different than us and we are no different than the land. That we are one.
And we've seen a cultural shift. We know that the people that came before us, they knew it was stinky. I mean, some of them called it the lake of disappointment. And at the same time, there was a vertical migration of humans that would come down into the wetlands and feed on the birds and the plants in the wetlands. And it was very much revered, and they relied on that. And then, when the Mormon pioneers came, they also, they revered the lake because, they built this saltaire, and they had a whole train system that went to this place because it's this ginormous lake that sits right on their shores. And so we have seen already a cultural shift from like an appreciation from the lake to a kind of forgetting about Great Salt Lake is kind of how I say. And I think there needs to be this cultural awakening of like, okay, this is really very important to not just birds, but also to humans.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. One of the conversations that you and I had recently was catching up on literature about Great Salt Lake. And I remembered, this seems like so long ago now, that I had so much content in my book on Spiral Jetty, I just sort of like couldn't stop. I'd never written a book before, so I couldn't stop. And my editor said, yeah, but you need to pull a whole lot of that information out. And that information I pulled out is this cultural consideration of Great Salt Lake over time. And what does it look like now as we are in climate crisis, as opposed to how we interpret indigenous populations and how they also were at the lake. And so I'm looking forward at some point to wrapping up my current manuscript, moving on, right? Having all the books to write and thinking I'm going to live to be 110. That's the only way I'm going to pull this off.
And maybe we can talk about some of this stuff too, because the issue of access to Great Salt Lake. And so right now, there's really, the way I see it, there's pretty much 4 places that you can access Great Salt Lake. You can go to Great Salt Lake State Park, that's at the south end of the lake. Very interesting place. Maybe people that are here can link in the comments to the Mirabolite mounds that are right now at the Great Salt Lake Marina. They're really beautiful crystalline structures that only occur in the wintertime and come from groundwater that flows up. You can visit Great Salt Lake in the wetlands through the waterfowl management areas, Farmington Bay, Ogden Bay, and the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. That's where all of the fresh water enters into Great Salt Lake, and that's where a lot of the bird concentrations are. Of course, there's Antelope Island that you can go visit and see bison and pronghorn, and the causeway actually splits the lake it kind of makes this other micro environment. And so when you travel the Antelope Island Causeway, you can see birds on either side. It's actually a very, very cool place. Yeah. And then Spiral Jetty. I mean, Spiral Jetty is one of the, that's one of the only reasons that we can see that pink water of the north arm of Great Salt Lake. And I think that it's a pretty amazing a testament, but I just want, people who are here to know those are kind of the places that you can go to see the lake. And I would encourage you, I would cheer you on, go to Great Salt Lake. And I'm going to give you a couple tips.
Does it have to do with bug spray?
So there are these vile little biting gnats. People call them no-see-ums. The no-see-ums, I think they drink DEET as their like pre-blood meal cocktail. They don't respond to DEET. So going out to the lake from about April until June, you might get bit up by bugs. There's a period of time in August and the late July and August where there are lots of spiders at Great Salt Lake that you see. They're not poisonous, they're not toxic, they don't bite. But if you're scared of spiders, you probably should not go during that time. And my biggest tip for Great Salt Lake, and this is going to sound really weird, my biggest tip for visiting Great Salt Lake is don't be afraid to just stay in your car. So sometimes you go to the lake and it's going to be windy, it'll be cold, it'll feel like it's 800 degrees. There will be bugs. And so don't be afraid to stay in your car if you need to and look at the environment around you. But then other days, you know, we were just out there this winter, just a couple weeks ago, and it was the most glorious day that you could ever imagine. So if I could just give tips on where to go and what to avoid, those are kind of the big things that I would say.
That's great. That's great.
Can I ask you too? I really want to get to this because actually some of my favorite memories of visiting Great Salt Lake and particularly Spiral Jetty is the journey. The journey to Spiral Jetty is like one of the most special things ever. And I have this very vivid memory. I have lots of memories from going out there, but I remember me and you and Rosalie Winard is she
all the dogs.
Yeah, we had all these dogs in the car, and somehow we got on this like giggle trip where we were laughing hysterically, and we just had like the most amazing time. And so Spiral Jetty wasn't the thing that really caught my attention that day. It was like being with my friends and having this journey. So maybe you can speak to some of that.
Sure. That was a great day. That was when I still had my clunker of a Jeep. I loved that Jeep. Long gone. And you're right. It was, we had a destination. We had our tribe, we had our dogs, right? And we had that, and I'm getting a little, I mean, you know, I've been in isolation for almost a year at this point. I might be in New Mexico and not in Utah, but I'm still doing the same isolation here that I've been doing for almost a year. So I'm getting a little verklempt right now, thinking about being in a car with a bunch of girlfriends and dogs and going places. It's right. That's from the past, but that journey was important. We had the end, we had that. And with all of the times that I've been out there too, it's that journey and it's those memories. And I want to now, of course, do what I do, which is bring it back to Robert Smithson. Because for him, it was, I mean, there's no questioning what he was thinking about with this idea of writing an essay and talking about, well, I wanted to go, everything is about travel for him. I wanted to go to Bolivia. I was in California. I wanted to go to Bolivia. Instead, I went to Utah. And then here were my trips to Utah. And here's what it was like to be at the site. And so sort of I don't want to say a simple way to describe it is that he certainly was traveling constantly and all the time. He, you know, had the travel bug, but it goes deeper than that too, because the trip is the journey, which is part of the work itself. And it's tied into the ideas, circling back to what we talked about previously, that Spiral Jetty is a temporal work of art. It is based in time. Time is a medium. And so the amount of time it takes to get in your car, to drive out there, to be there, to walk Spiral Jetty, to be in that landscape, to do all of those things, that's all of that experience, whether you've got preconceived notions or not, of then being there and being at the site. And it's all based on time. It's performative. Every trip out to Spiral Jetty is a performative action. And Robert Smithson knew that. He wanted that.
And it is, you know, I taught my kid to drive on the road to Spiral Jetty. The first time he ever drove me anywhere, we were in that van, and, you know, your heart kind of drops a little bit when you realize that your teenage kid is in control of your life. I mean, yeah.
My dog is, that's as far as I go.
What do you think that, like, what do you think, and maybe this is a silly question, but what do you think he would think about where Spiral Jetty is now in the hearts of Utah, and like, do you have thoughts on that? Or
I don't. I always steer clear of. I'm going to answer your question with the caveat that I always steer clear of what do you think Robert Smithson would think, because I don't go there. I never met him. I could, if you asked me certain things about Nancy Holt, I could tell you conversations we had, but I never, he died when I was an early teenager or something. So that's not a thing. So I don't know the answer to that. I think that because he saturated the art world with Spiral Jetty, he would be certainly pleased that the audience expanded. So when I wrote my master's thesis in art history on Spiral Jetty in 1996, it was about local reaction to Spiral Jetty. When I talked to my thesis advisor at Hunter College in New York and said I wanted to write about Spiral Jetty, he said, you can't do that. Spiral Jetty is a dead work of art. It's been underwater, it's gone. I won't permit you to write it. And I'm in Utah, he's in New York City. And I, back then, it's not like I'm using my phone to send him pictures, but I got pictures of Spiral Jetty from 1993 and 94, and I sent them to him and I said, yeah, it's not dead. It's right there. It's still there. And he gave me the green light to write my thesis. So there's that interesting, from 1995 and 96, sort of I shine a spotlight on local reaction to Spiral Jetty. 93, there's a helicopter that goes over it and the stories and the pelicans that have died and what's taking place out there, right? There's a huge cache of material from that time period. But then it goes back underwater and it comes back out again. And interestingly, it comes back out around 2002, 2003. And by 2004, when we've got these luscious, amazing, really stunningly beautiful photographs of Spiral Jetty, that's the year of that traveling national retrospective on on Robert Smithson's work. And so the art world is just gifted with not only Robert Smithson's, this amazing exhibition that travels, but anybody who's interested in that and goes to Spiral Jetty in 2004 sees a stunning work of art that is, as you said, pink or hot pink or covered in salt or white. Anybody, not now because we're talking, but later, Google Spiral Jetty 2004 and the pictures are astounding.
I visited it first. My kid was on my back. My kid just went to college. and it had just come out of water. It was probably 2003 and you could just see the very tipsy tops.
Okay.
And I'm gonna bring in a question from Matt Coombs. And at first I want to recognize there's a group of organizations who work to steward Spiral Jetty with the Dia Art Foundation, and one of those is Great Salt Lake Institute, Dia Art Foundation, and the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. And I would include in that the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, who manages the bed of the lake. And Matt wants to know, he's from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, he wants to know if we think the journey to the Spiral Jetty has changed significantly since the road has been improved. And so that first time that I went to the jetty, I would have broken my oil pan off on the rocks. There were these giant volcanic basalt rocks that were in the middle of the road. And I think in 2010, I'm not sure, Matt, you can correct me, but the county, Box Elder County, came in and go ahead then, tell me.
It was earlier. Actually, I'm going to look it up. I thought it was 2006, but maybe it was 2010. Came in and repainted it.
So they came in and they graded the road and took all of those rocks out. And I admit, I was disappointed because it was kind of this journey where you would park a quarter of a mile from the jetty and you would walk down there. Do you think that that journey has changed?
Um, it's
While
that
you're looking,
interesting. And oh, did you ask me that or Matt, your friend Matt?
no, I want to ask you that. And does improving access to the jetty, does it erode the experience?
So I don't think that it erodes it, it changes it. I do want to make an addition to the people who steward Spiral Jetty and
I
include,
did, yeah.
that's it's a new organization. It's Holt Smithson Foundation that was established when Nancy Holt was ill, knowing that she had an aggressive form of cancer. She wanted a foundation to be established based on her work and Robert Smithson's work, and that foundation has been working through, and now we are 3 years, I think, maybe a little over 3 years into the foundation, and the amount of programming that they do is incredible. And I'm really, because I'm talking about this right now, I'm going to do a shout out because I would like to thank the foundation because I'm currently in Santa Fe doing a research fellowship with them on Nancy Holt's library. And so the amount of programming that is available through Holt Smithson Foundation is awesome. The amount of scholarship has just exploded through all of that. And now, that PSA aside, I want to get back to your question. It was, I think 2010, it was Obama stimulus money that Box Elder County used to regrade the road, that last 3.5 miles of road, because so many people were going out there. If it was 2006 or 2010, and my book's an encyclopedia, but there isn't an index, and so I can't find it right now. Sorry. But so many people were going out there because, again, from 2004 on, the number of people who wanted to be out there was so huge that the county had to deal on a regular basis with people getting flat tires, people losing oil pans, right? I mean, not wanting people to really like be left sort of high and dry out there. And I do understand that people who had a specific either appreciation for or nostalgia for that idea of that journey being rough, that last part of that journey being treacherous, that was gone. And I was quite happy about it, actually, because I would go out so often that I too was worried about that. I had somebody who I took out there for the first time, and I was so freaked out that this person wouldn't be able to play with his band that night because I was going to get flat tires. And I did get flat tires, but they were flat the next day. And he was able to play with his band and everything was fine, but it was kind of horrifying to go through that process. There does tend to be, the parking lot seems to be getting bigger out there. There is the Eagle Scout plaque that is information about Spiral Jetty that has been embedded out there. And so there are different and new cultural ways that land has been changed and imprinted. And that's what happens. We're humans. That's what we do.
And somebody anonymous said, how do you prevent it from being overrun as a tourist destination?
You know,
and I know a lot of people have other thoughts than I do. I think that it's really cool that people want to go out there, and I think that our population is increasing, and I think that people seeing land art, being able to see Great Salt Lake and interact with it, I think is very special. And I don't think any of us have an answer as to how do we prevent it from being overrun. I mean,
it's interesting, you know, thinking about, and again, we get to hold both things at the same time. In the 1970s, when these were big, huge, barren swaths of land that were so hard to get to, a lot of people weren't going to them. Certain key players in the art world were going to them. Now that information is not as, it's not private, it's not privileged, we've got easy access to be able to get out there, right? People can do that. And that is today. I think my caution and my great hope is that you're not taking pickaxes out there and taking rocks. That it is honored as a site that has, in its own right, huge cultural artistic significance. And because of that, and then all of the cultural artistic sort of spokes that Robert Smithson brings into this, there's a lot that we can consider and honor and treasure and respect and certainly enjoy out there. So,
and I guess I would add to that, I think there's a huge local component that maybe was unexpected, or that was unexpected by me, of people that are local Box Elder County people who like to drive their ATVs out there, that like to go visit, that to me was a little bit unexpected, and I think is very cool and very special to have pride in this place and make a relationship with it, you know?
Well, so in 1970, right, the building of Spiral Jetty, there are, between 1970 and 1973, 3 articles in Utah published about Spiral Jetty. 3. One is in Box Elder County. There's a newspaper article in Box Elder County. The Department of, what did the geology used to be called? Geology and mineralogy.
I'm not sure.
I hate giving bad information out. That's so bad. It is right here. My goodness. The Utah Geological and Mineralogical Survey, in their quarterly review in 1971, writes a full-page article about Spiral Jetty. So Box Elder County does an article, the Geological Mineralogical Survey, and then the Salt Lake Tribune in 1973 writes an article about Spiral Jetty because it's gone underwater. And they interestingly missed the fact that a couple weeks before they published the article, Robert Smithson had died in that plane crash. And so that again, that's that sort of like review and looking at local reaction. There's not much in the 70s. And in the 90s, that 93 to 95 time period, there's a lot that comes out then. And then when it comes back out, there's been even more. So it's, you know, the times change.
Yeah. And so we have, I think, like 6 minutes. We have 6 minutes. And
I know, the time has been flying.
I know. I want to talk about how to visit Spiral Jetty. Is it hard to visit? How do you visit Spiral Jetty?
It is so easy to go to Dia Art Foundation's website. And so that is diaart, diaart.org. And as you look at, Dia Art Foundation has been a huge steward of multiple land art sites. A couple years ago, acquiring Sun Tunnels, our other very famous earthwork in Utah. They've got excellent directions on how to get out there.
Yeah.
So.
And just a note, Pam was asking about if I could get there in a sedan, and you can definitely get there in a sedan.
Absolutely.
You can drive all the way there. I wouldn't encourage it if there's a snowstorm, but any other time is a great time to visit that.
Yeah,
and
any time, any season, right? Just don't get stuck out there in a snowstorm.
And my favorite time, actually, I'm going to tell you a secret, and hopefully not everybody rushes out there. October, that's my favorite time to visit Great Salt Lake. October is amazing.
It's amazing. I'm September, October. I like when the days start to get golden, when the lake starts to change and the colors start to happen. So that September, October period for me. Yeah. But any day out there is a great day. Just don't, go in a storm.
Yeah. Yeah. And then is it disrespectful to walk on the spiral, Hikmet?
No. And in fact, we've been talking about the earthwork. This is a great time to say that Spiral Jetty is sort of made up of 3 major components. the essay that I've been talking about, the Earthwork, and the film that Robert Smithson created in 1970 on Spiral Jetty. It runs about 32 minutes. And there is a fabulous section in there because what he does, it's a film in like basically 3 parts. And when he's done building Spiral Jetty, you see him, Robert Smithson, running the length of Spiral Jetty. You mentioned earlier in our program tonight, it was 1,500 feet long, 15 feet wide, and the helicopter is above him, training over him with him in his sight, running the whole length. And you see this happening the whole length. And you think, well, he'll get there eventually, right? We know that's going to happen. And it isn't until he gets to the end and the helicopter sort of pulls away and there's this huge rush of air that's going on because the helicopter is so close to him, right? We've never seen his face. He's the anonymous person who is having their experience in their trip at Spiral Jetty. And the helicopter pulls away and then he slowly starts walking back and going the spiral in another way. It was absolutely intended to be experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were some questions about organizations and places that people could go to see more about the Jetty and Great Salt Lake. I did share a link in the chat. I do work for Great Salt Lake Institute. We do a lot of education and lots of programming. The link in the chat to a Google document will be kind of updated. There's lots of different events on when the Mars rover lands, what readings to read about Spiral Jetty, essays that we have written about the Jetty. You can visit Great Salt Lake Institute at it's greatsaltlakeinstitute.org, or on Facebook is probably the best place to interact and find places to visit. And so please use us. I mean, I'm the one updating all of our social media, and I'm a total Great Salt Lake nerd.
Yeah. And I've just added into the chat holtzsmithsonfoundation.org.
Yep. And they're also on there too.
That's excellent. They have, again, their programming is astounding. And so they have a series of scholarly essays that they're publishing. They started that first series of them, and that first essay in that first series was Spiral Jetty. And it's just been continuing on since.
How do people see the film on Spiral Jetty that you talked about?
It is a film that is a work of art. It is distributed in New York City through Electronic Arts Intermix, EAI. Because it is a work of art, you're not going to find it on Amazon Prime. Mm-hmm. It is a different sort of consideration to have that. Occasionally, I've seen that Utah Museum of Fine Arts shows it. Utah Museum of Contemporary Art downtown shows it. And the other, back to Holtz-Smithson Foundation, they have Movie Fridays.
That's where I saw it.
And so on Movie Fridays, it's kind of fabulous. If you don't follow them on Instagram, definitely pick them up, because they will show these movies. So they've shown Spiral Jetty in the past, they've shown Sun Tunnels, and it's one of those things I appreciate that the art world has responded to our current times and COVID in really expanding and opening up their art, their resources. And it may be a work of art that's hard to, the films are hard to get to in a certain kind of a way. But if you kind of go through that and just start looking and trolling around the internet, it's pretty interesting what's available and what's out there now.
Yeah.
Great.
And I want to end on one, well, I don't want to end on this question. I'm going to answer Pam really quick about what bird migrations are interesting. I would say, Great Salt Lake hosts 10 million birds, and it's not just in the summertime, it's also in the wintertime. And so right now, there are tundra swans that are in the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, major migratory bird pathway. Most of the migrations happen in May. And I would definitely suggest checking out the Great Salt Lake Bird Festival, because they will help you know, all of these bird nerds will help you know where to go to see these birds. But any place, Farmington Bay, Ogden Bay Waterfowl Management Area, the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, and the Antelope Island Causeway is pretty unparalleled in being able to see birds during the end part of May. You will see tons of species of birds, and even if you don't know what the little brown bird is, you're going to see avocets and pelicans and great blue herons. So I love that question. And if you had like one last thing to say, Hikmet, what would you say?
You know,
I'm putting you on the spot.
No, I think you know me well enough to know that I like to give thanks all the time. And because Glenda Cotter, the who runs the University of Utah Press, has been with us this evening, I would just like to do a shout out to the University of Utah Press for publishing my book. Who knew that an art book that was in an encyclopedic format would actually work? I didn't know that that would work out, and it did. I would like to do a shout out. The University of Utah Press at the University of Utah does an amazing job. And Glenda, I'm working on the next one for you. Here in New Mexico, working on sun tunnels, more soon. So it's just more of a thanks. And what has been really great about seeing the chat and the questions are the variety of questions and comments that have come through. It's nice to see some familiar voices and some of them, you know, through that venue. But it's also really nice, Jaimi, to be with you and to be able to share this experience with you. So thank you.
Yeah, and I love that.
There we go.
And I echo and amplify like all of the things for everybody who is caring about Great Salt Lake and caring about Spiral Jetty. And I would encourage you to, you know, take more action. Like we all have a part to play in keeping Great Salt Lake and keeping Spiral Jetty. And so, you know, please like take whatever action that you can take in your own life and talk to people. Tell people how cool the lake is. It's not just stinky and smelly, that it's very important to our economy, to our health, to our quality of life. And I just like thank you everybody for coming. And we kind of went a little bit over, but not too much over. We did really good. So thank you.
And I'm going to, I just added, oh, and I totally misspelled it. Friends of Great Salt Lake is not fogs.org. So sorry, fogsol.org. Check them out too. They do a lot of activism. I think my final comment would be this idea that the lake is huge in geography and in our minds. But it's not, and we're all tied together because of our ecosystems and because of where we are. And we're tied to Canada, and we're tied to Argentina, and we're tied to each other. And it's because of the ecosystem that we have. And this is when we get to care about it.